trash like you belongs in a fucking dumpster, not a courthouse. Have you ever wanted to see karma delivered so brutally, so completely, that it changes everything? If so, buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the bell, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this incredible story of justice. Those words, spat with the venom of 1,000 years of hatred, would echo in Officer Frank Miller's mind until his dying day, a permanent brand on what was left of his soul. Judge Evelyn Hayes, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue pantsuit, approached the grand stone steps of the Harrison County Federal Courthouse. In her hand, she carried a worn leather briefcase filled with the lives and futures of the people whose cases she would hear today. To her, these steps were a daily pilgrimage, a reminder of the sacred trust placed in her. To Officer Miller, standing guard like a self-appointed Cerberus at the gates of his personal hell, she was just another piece of garbage trying to infest his clean, white world. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in, he muttered under his breath, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his baton. He planted his feet, a wall of starched blue fabric and simmering rage, blocking her path. His eyes, small and hard like chips of ice, raked over her with a contempt so pure it was almost a physical force. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask her business. He saw her skin, her gender, and his mind, a murky swamp of prejudice, filled in the rest. His open palm, calloused and thick, cracked against her face with a sound that seemed to shatter the morning quiet. The force of the blow was sickening, snapping her head to the side so violently that for a moment the world was a black and white blur of spinning concrete and sky. The expensive briefcase, a gift from her late husband, flew from her grasp. Its contents, judicial orders, sensitive case files, handwritten legal notes, erupted into the air, scattering across the courthouse steps like a tragic parody of confetti. Before she could even register the searing pain in her jaw, Miller was on her. He grabbed her by the throat, his fingers digging into her flesh, and slammed her backward against the cold, unyielding stone of the courthouse wall. Her head connected with the granite with a dull thud. "Trash like you belongs in a fucking dumpster, not a courthouse," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and self-righteousness. He twisted her arms behind her back with practiced brutality, the metal teeth of the handcuffs biting deep into her wrists, a cold, sharp promise of the nightmare to come. Other officers, Donovan and Russo, drawn by the commotion, didn't rush to intervene. They sauntered over, laughing, pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. The sound of their amusement was somehow more violating than the physical assault. Evelyn's jaw throbbed with a deep, pulsating ache, but through the haze of pain, her eyes remained fixed, locked on the polished bronze nameplate mounted above the courthouse entrance, a nameplate she saw every single day. The Honorable Judge Evelyn M. Hayes, presiding. She was less than 20 feet from her own courtroom, being brutalized, humiliated, and dehumanized by the very system she had sworn an oath to uphold. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth, mingling with the blood from her cut lip. Have you ever seen instant karma this brutal, this absolute? Stick with me, because what happens next is a masterclass in justice. Inside the courtroom, a temporary chamber assigned for preliminary hearings, Officer Miller straightened his uniform, his face a mask of professional calm. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed room. He had performed this ballet of deceit countless times before. Spin the story, control the narrative, paint himself as the hero standing on the thin blue line between order and chaos. The system, his system, always believed the cop over the criminal, especially when the criminal looked like her. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice a steady, practiced baritone, addressing the temporary judge, a pale, tired-looking man named Peterson. I was conducting routine security protocols at the main entrance when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his hand toward Evelyn, who now sat in handcuffs at the defendant's table, a grotesque purple bruise already blooming across her left cheek, a stark contrast to her dark skin. The defendant was acting erratically, refusing to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Peterson, a man whose primary judicial talent was nodding in agreement with authority figures, did just that. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Miller?" "Well, sir," Miller said, his eyes gleaming as he warmed to his fabrication. "She was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents. The lie was so effortless, so smooth, it was clear he had told variations of it hundreds of times before. When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats against my person." From the gallery, Officers Donovan and Russo exchanged a knowing look. It was the same script, different day. They'd seen Miller run this play on dozens of faces, all of them black or brown, all of them now just another statistic in a broken system. "She kept screaming about being someone important," Miller continued, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. "These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. It's a classic tactic." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest?" "Absolutely," Miller said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety and the security of this federal building." His hand trembled, just for a second, a tiny crack in his polished facade, the only outward sign of the lie's immense weight. The court stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every perjured word for posterity. In the back row, a young law clerk, a recent graduate full of ideals, frowned. Something about the woman at the defendant's table felt wrong. She seemed too composed, too intelligent for the part Miller had cast her in. "Officer Donovan," the prosecutor, Diane Jennings, called out, "can you corroborate Officer Miller's testimony?" Donovan stood, his uniform pressed to military perfection, a stark contrast to the moral filth it concealed. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Miller handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Peterson inquired, his tone already suggesting he'd accepted Miller's version of events. Miller's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your Honor, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive and non-compliant individual who posed a direct threat to courthouse security. The defendant's injuries, if any, are a direct result of her own violent resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently began mid-confrontation after the initial slap. "I have partial footage here, though unfortunately my body cam malfunctioned this morning. Battery issue." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. "How convenient," Evelyn murmured, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's stale air like a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm sorry?" Judge Peterson raised an eyebrow, annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her gaze a burning laser of controlled fury fixed on Miller. Miller, emboldened, pressed his advantage. "What we're seeing here, Your Honor, is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents, and when confronted with her criminal behavior, she immediately cried discrimination. It's textbook." The prosecutor, Diane Jennings, a woman who saw her job not as finding truth, but as securing convictions, nodded sympathetically. Officer Miller, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes. All the time. There's a pattern here. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that the rules simply don't apply to them. They weaponize accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal actions. Miller's voice rose with righteous indignation, a performance worthy of a stage. It's honestly insulting to the real victims of discrimination. Several people in the gallery, mostly white courthouse employees, nodded in agreement. It was a familiar story, a comfortable narrative they'd heard on the news and seen on social media. It reinforced their worldview. The defendant claims she was going to work, Miller said, making air quotes with his fingers in a gesture of pure mockery. But she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area of the courthouse. Officer Russo, the third member of their corrupt trio, stepped forward. If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. We suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme. Judge Peterson looked intrigued. Fraud scheme? Yes, sir. Miller jumped back in, sensing the momentum was all his. These documents had judicial letterhead, case numbers, and highly sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to sensitive areas. The irony was so thick it was practically suffocating. But Miller, high on his own power, pressed on, completely oblivious to the elaborate trap he was setting for himself. In my professional opinion, he concluded, puffing out his chest, this is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. It's a calculated, cynical manipulation of public sympathy. He turned to face Evelyn directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous. These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose, and when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse, not on my watch. The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Your Honor, Prosecutor Jennings added, the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate and baseless defense strategy. Miller allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This was perfect. Another case closed, another win for the good guys, another reminder that the system worked just the way it was designed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. Furthermore, he continued, feeling invincible, I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used much more significant force. Judge Peterson nodded gravely. Your professionalism is noted, Officer Miller. In the defendant's chair, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, despite the cold bite of the handcuffs. Her expression remained calm, almost serene. But anyone looking closely, anyone who truly knew her, would have noticed the slight, dangerous upturn at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't just listening. She was taking meticulous mental notes of every lie, every fabrication, every single detail that would soon be used to unravel Miller's career, his reputation, and his freedom. The officer had absolutely no idea he was delivering his own eulogy in front of the one person on earth who held the power to utterly destroy him. Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer? Judge Peterson asked. Miller straightened his shoulders, basking in the glow of his perceived victory. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic, how perfectly ironic those words would prove to be. The prosecutor smiled confidently. "The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and resistance to lawful authority." As Miller stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Evelyn's eye one last time. He winked at her. A gesture of complete dominance, of total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire life. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Peterson announced, his tone bored, suggesting this was a mere formality before he handed down her sentence. Evelyn Hayes rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly in the quiet room. Despite the ugly bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity, a powerful aura that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice was clear, controlled, and carried an innate authority that seemed to fill the entire room, changing its very atmosphere. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Judge Peterson blinked. Something in her tone, cool, professional, precise, was completely unexpected. It didn't match the narrative of the hysterical, aggressive criminal he'd just been presented. "First," she began, "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Miller's sworn testimony." Evelyn's eyes swept the courtroom methodically, her gaze lingering for a moment on each person who had supported the officer's cascade of lies. "According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Peterson directly as an equal. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. The prosecutor frowned, a flicker of unease crossing her face. This wasn't the rambling, emotional outburst they expected from a cornered suspect. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering, "Officer Miller testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been piled. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files for United States v. Peterson, judicial memoranda regarding sentencing guidelines, and administrative correspondence for this district, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity." "Professional capacity?" Judge Peterson interrupted, his curiosity finally outweighing his indifference. "And what exactly is your profession, Miss—" Evelyn paused, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Williams, Dr. Evelyn Williams, and I believe we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." A cold chill, sharp and unwelcome, ran down Officer Miller's spine. Something was terribly, terribly wrong with this picture. "Your Honor, if I may continue," Evelyn said, her voice taking on the familiar cadence of someone completely at home in a courtroom, someone who commanded it. "Officer Miller also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may or may not have made during the alleged incident." She let that sink in for a moment. "However, I will note for the record that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, without warning, and without any legal justification whatsoever." The young law clerk in the back row sat up straighter, her mind racing. That voice, that command of legal procedure, it was so familiar. "Now, Regarding the officer's claim that his body cam malfunctioned, Evelyn continued, and now there was steel in her voice. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, the rule of completeness, which allows for the introduction of related evidence to provide context. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court. Judge Peterson leaned forward, his bored expression replaced with one of intense focus. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Additionally, Harrison County maintains automatic cloud-based backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of any claimed equipment malfunctions on the device itself. The color drained from Frank Miller's face. In his arrogant rush to control the narrative, he had completely forgotten about the courthouse's own security cameras. I would like to formally request, Evelyn continued, her voice ringing with newfound power, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 a.m. and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to all courthouse security footage, all body cam backup files, and any and all mobile phone recordings that may have been made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Jennings stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Evelyn turned to face the prosecutor with a look so cold, so withering, that the woman took an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's absolute obligation to preserve and turn over any and all potentially exculpatory evidence. Are you suggesting we ignore both the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent, Ms. Jennings? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases were supposed to go. Judge Peterson cleared his throat, suddenly looking very small behind the large bench. Miss Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor, was her carefully neutral reply, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked dangerously like amusement. She walked, as much as the handcuffs would allow, to the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Miller's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized. She pointed to a specific document among the papers. This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to preside over... I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. this morning. The bailiff, a large man named Henderson, who had worked in this courthouse for 20 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Evelyn, a look of dawning recognition and abject horror spreading across his face. Officer Miller testified that I claimed to be someone important, Evelyn continued. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Miller's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. Judge Peterson was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable, like a man who realized he'd wandered into a minefield. What kind of documentation? Evelyn reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid startling anyone. From it, she produced 3 items. My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office, my building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's entry code, and my official identification. The bailiff, Henderson, shot to his feet, his face as pale as a ghost. He knew. He had seen her every day for years. Your Honor, Evelyn said quietly. "I believe there's been a catastrophic misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Miller assaulted this morning." She held up a leather credential wallet. Even from across the room, the gleaming gold judicial seal of the United States Federal Court was clearly, unmistakably visible. "Perhaps we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified," she suggested, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. Judge Peterson stared at the credential wallet, then at Evelyn's face, then at the bailiff, who was now nodding grimly, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he said hoarsely. As the gavel fell, Frank Miller felt his entire world, the solid ground of his authority and privilege, begin to crumble into dust around him. Whatever game he thought he was playing, he was just beginning to realize he didn't even understand the rules. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with a frantic, nervous energy that felt like static electricity in the air. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Evelyn sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely find the lock. The reality of what had just happened was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Judge Hayes," he whispered, his voice thick with horror as the handcuffs finally clicked open. "Jesus Christ, Judge Hayes. I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in your civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that, all bruised, It's all right, Henderson," Evelyn replied softly, rubbing her chafed wrists. "You weren't part of this, but I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it now." "Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers, go quietly, and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim. And Henderson?" She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady and intense. "Bring my gavel, too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and practically ran out of the room, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a deep, centering breath, a technique she had perfected over her 23 years on the bench. This morning, she had walked toward this building as Judge Evelyn Hayes, respected jurist, protector of constitutional rights, a guardian of justice. In the span of 15 minutes, Officer Miller had transformed her into a victim, a defendant, a nameless, faceless ghetto rat in handcuffs. But now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned by a trembling Henderson, buzzed incessantly with missed calls and frantic messages. Her clerk, Janet Morrison, had sent a string of escalating texts. "Judge Hayes, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Should I postpone? Judge Hayes, please call me back. There are rumors that something happened outside." Evelyn typed back quickly, her fingers flying across the screen. "Tell the Peterson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my entire afternoon calendar." She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district, her friend and mentor. "Margaret, it's Evelyn." "Evelyn, thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident at the courthouse. Are you all right?" "I've been better, Margaret. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking any questions right now." "Of course, whatever you need." "I need you to contact the courthouse security office and tell them to immediately preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Margaret, make sure there are multiple redundant copies stored in different secure locations." There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, what exactly happened this morning?" A police officer named Frank Miller just spent the better part of an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property. Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a cold fury that Chief Judge Carter had never heard before. And the dangerous criminal was me, Margaret, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of this courthouse, called me trash, and told me I belonged in a fucking dumpster. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds, a void filled with unspoken shock and rage. Jesus Christ, Evelyn, what do you need? Should I call the FBI? The Attorney General's office? Not yet. Right now, I need those surveillance recordings secured beyond any possibility of disappearing, and I need you to make some phone calls. I want every single case Officer Frank Miller has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and flagged for immediate review. Every single one. Consider it done. But Evelyn, you can't handle this case yourself. There's a clear conflict of interest. Oh, I'm not going to handle this case, Margaret. I'm going to end it. And in about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Officer Miller is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning. And more importantly, he's going to learn who has the power to ensure he faces the full and terrifying consequences of his actions. Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small, polished wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel. Evelyn stood and unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor for more than 2 decades. As she slipped them on over her bruised body, she felt the transformation begin. The heavy fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each fold and crease was a reminder of the immense power she wielded, the sacred oaths she had taken, the justice she was sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words, Justitia caeca est, sed omnia videt. Justice is blind, but she sees all. Henderson, she said, adjusting her robes, her voice now devoid of any trace of the victim she had been portrayed as. When we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me. Properly. Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced? Evelyn Hayes straightened to her full height, her posture radiating an authority that was absolute, every inch the federal judge she had been for the past 23 years. The Honorable Judge Evelyn M. Hayes, presiding. She glanced at herself in a small mirror on the wall. The purple bruise on her cheek was still starkly visible, but now it served a different purpose. It wasn't just evidence of Miller's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen, and how completely, how seismically, it was about to be restored. When court resumes, she thought, Officer Miller will learn what justice really means. All rise! Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with a newfound authority that made every single person snap to attention. But what happened next was a moment that would be seared into their memories forever. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn M. Hayes, presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Officer Miller, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, whispering with Jennings, went rigid, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. Judge Peterson, still seated in what he now realized with dawning horror was not his chair, turned a color of white usually reserved for corpses. The prosecutor's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. Judge Evelyn Hayes entered through the judge's chamber door, wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. She moved with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound you could hear the frantic pounding of hearts. Not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately. Her eyes, cold and sharp as fragments of obsidian, swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every single person who was finally, terrifyingly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Miller," she said quietly, but her voice, amplified by the courtroom's acoustics and her own immense authority, carried the weight of an avalanche. "You may remain standing." Miller looked like he was about to vomit. His face had cycled from red to white to a sickly green in the span of 30 seconds. Your Honor," Judge Peterson stammered, scrambling to rise from the judge's chair. We didn't. I mean to say—" "Judge Peterson," Evelyn interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket. I will handle this matter from here." Peterson practically fled from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him as if he were being chased by demons. Evelyn turned her full attention back to Miller, who was now visibly shaking, his entire body trembling with a fear so profound it was almost palpable. "Officer Miller, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" I... Miller couldn't form words. His tongue felt thick and useless in his dry mouth. "Let me refresh your memory," Evelyn continued, her voice as cold and precise as a coroner's report. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Miller nodded weakly, a pathetic, jerky movement of his head. "You also stated that I was, quote, 'another entitled activist looking for a payday,' and that you had seen, quote, 'this playbook before.' Is that an accurate recollection of your testimony?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. "And perhaps most memorably," Evelyn's voice grew even colder, "you stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall dispensing that particular piece of wisdom, Officer Miller?" Miller's legs were shaking so hard he could barely stand. Evelyn reached under her bench and pulled out a tablet computer, its screen glowing in the dim light. "Officer Miller, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just been brought to my attention." She turned the tablet's screen so the entire courtroom could see. On it was crystal clear, high-definition security camera footage of the courthouse steps, showing the entire morning's incident from multiple damning angles. "This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance," she announced. Her finger touched the screen, and the video began to play. The courtroom watched in stunned, horrified silence as the events unfolded. There was Evelyn, walking calmly toward the courthouse. There was Miller blocking her path. And then his voice, clear as day, captured by the camera's sensitive microphone, filled the courtroom through the tablet's speakers. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in?" Several people gasped audibly. The prosecutor, Diane Jennings, looked as though she was about to faint. The video continued, showing Miller's unprovoked, brutal assault in vivid, sickening detail. The slap that snapped Evelyn's head sideways. The brutal shove against the wall, the handcuffs, but the most damning moment was yet to come. "Trash like you belongs in a fucking dumpster, not a courthouse." Miller's own words, spoken with such venom and hatred, echoed through his courtroom, the one he claimed to protect. Several jurors from other cases who had been waiting in the gallery stood up and walked out in disgust. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, pausing the video, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Miller remained silent, his career, his life, disintegrating before his very eyes. "Now," Evelyn continued, her voice relentless, Let's examine your claim that your body cam malfunctioned. She swiped to a new video file. This is backup footage from your own body cam, automatically uploaded to the county's cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed. The new video began playing, and Miller's voice filled the courtroom again, but this time it was even worse. This was the complete, unedited version, the thoughts he thought were private. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse," Miller's voice snarled through the speakers, recorded just before the confrontation. "These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another one a lesson." Prosecutor Jennings was frantically gathering her papers, trying to physically distance herself from the catastrophe unfolding before her. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. "Officer Donovan, Officer Russo," she called out, her voice like the crack of a whip. "You both testified under oath that Officer Miller handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements now?" Both officers were already edging towards the exit, their faces pale with terror. "And here," Evelyn said, advancing the video to show the assault from Miller's own first-person perspective. "We can see the precise moment when Officer Miller committed felony assault against a federal judge." She let those last two words hang in the air for a moment, each one a death sentence. Federal? Judge. Miller's knees finally buckled. He grabbed onto the prosecutor's table to keep from falling. "But wait," Evelyn said, her voice taking on an almost conversational, yet terrifying tone. "There's more." She pulled up a new file on her tablet. "This is audio from Officer Russo's body cam, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the courtroom. Russo's voice, speaking to Donovan while Miller was assaulting Evelyn. "Dude, Miller's really going off on this one. You think she's actually somebody important like she keeps trying to say?" Donovan's voice responded, followed by a snicker. "Nah, man. Look at her. Miller knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." More laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a sitting federal judge. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at the three officers with undisguised revulsion. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, setting down her tablet, her gaze pinning him in place. "You asked me earlier if I had any employment verification. Well, I do." She gestured to the Great Seal of the United States mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her nameplate, then to the official oil portrait of her that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Miller. Every case you've ever testified in, every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my ultimate authority." Miller finally found his voice, though it came out as a pathetic, strangled whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Evelyn repeated slowly, letting the pathetic excuse hang in the air. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman, and your mind, poisoned by bigotry, made a series of vile assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to indulge your appetite for cruelty." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into his. "But Officer Miller, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 6 months, my office has been conducting a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division into patterns of misconduct, racial bias, and perjury in the Harrison County Police Department." Miller's face went completely, impossibly white. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Miller. You have been under federal investigation for months, and you just handed us the most perfect, irrefutable, beautifully recorded evidence of your crimes we could have ever hoped for." She lifted her gavel, holding it in front of her like a scepter. "Officer Miller, you said actions have consequences. You were right about that." Her voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous promise. Court will recess while I consider the appropriate federal charges to be filed against you and your colleagues." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Frank Miller collapsed into a chair, a broken man. His career, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom were now hanging by the thinnest of threads, held in the hand of the woman he had tried to throw in a dumpster. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters had quietly filed into the gallery, drawn by whispers of the most spectacular courtroom reversal in the building's history. The room was packed, standing room only, every person there to witness the final act of this incredible drama. Miller sat slumped in what was now undeniably the defendant's chair, his uniform wrinkled, his face ashen. His hastily summoned attorney, a nervous public defender named Michael Carter, kept shooting worried glances at his client, knowing the case was already lost. Judge Evelyn Hayes returned to her bench with the same measured dignity she had displayed thousands of times before. But now, every eye in the room saw her differently. This wasn't just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutally assaulted by the man now trembling before her, and she was about to deliver justice not just for herself, but for every person he had ever wronged. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice resonating with the full weight of her 23 years of judicial authority. "Before we proceed with the serious federal and state criminal charges you now face, I believe this court, and everyone present, deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood, moving from behind the bench to address the packed courtroom directly, as if she were a professor lecturing on the very soul of justice. "My name is Judge Evelyn M. Hayes. I have served as the presiding judge of this federal courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2001, and I was confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous bipartisan vote." Her voice grew stronger with each word, a testament to a life built on merit and dedication. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice." Miller's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, likely calculating the astronomical number of years his client was facing. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor," she continued, her eyes sweeping over the rapt audience, "I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority and betrayed their oath." She paused, letting that number sink into the silent room. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every justification imaginable." Judge Hayes walked closer to where Miller sat cowering, a predator cornered. "But in all my years of service, Officer Miller, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect, such a textbook example of everything that is wrong with policing in America." The packed courtroom was silent, save for the sound of Miller's ragged, panicked breathing. "You see, Officer Miller, when you called me a ghetto rat and trash, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen." She returned to her position behind the bench, reclaiming her seat of power. "You were assaulting the very person who has dedicated her entire professional life to ensuring that officers exactly like you are held accountable for their actions." Judge Hayes opened a thick file that had been placed on her bench during the recess. "This file contains detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Miller. 43 times you have stood in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She flipped through several pages, her expression grim. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the sole arresting officer. And in every single one, Officer Miller, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. Miller's face had gone from white to a deathly gray. Acting erratically. Refusing to comply. Became aggressive. Threatening officer safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies, over and over and over again. Judge Hayes closed the file with a sharp, final snap. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Miller. The joint task force I mentioned earlier, the one with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice, that task force was created specifically to investigate you and your unit. The public defender stopped writing and simply stared at his client with an expression of profound pity. Your name, Officer Miller, has been at the top of a federal watch list for 18 months. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed by the best statisticians in the DOJ. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. And this morning, Officer Miller, you provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could ever dream of. Judge Hayes lifted her gavel. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed felony perjury when you lied under oath about the circumstances of that assault. The gavel hovered in the air like a guillotine. Officer Miller, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. Her voice filled the courtroom with quiet, unshakable authority. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the power we, the people, have entrusted to you. The gavel came down once, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. My place, Officer Miller, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. Miller finally understood. He hadn't just assaulted a random woman. He had assaulted justice itself, and justice was about to hit back with the force of a hurricane. Judge Hayes stood behind her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her like armor forged from justice itself. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a historic verdict. Officer Miller, she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. Before I render judgment in this matter, I want to address not just you, but everyone in this courtroom and everyone who will hear about what happened here today. She gestured to the gallery packed with lawyers, court staff, reporters, and citizens. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when someone with a badge and a gun believes they are above the law? What happens when years of unchecked power and systemic protection create a person who thinks they can assault a federal judge on the steps of her own courthouse and face no consequences? Miller sat slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his life and career crumbling around him in real time. The answer, Officer Miller, she declared, is standing before you right now. Judge Hayes picked up her gavel, the same one engraved with the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." For 15 years you have terrorized this community. For 15 years you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years you have made a mockery of the badge you were sworn to honor. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. But your greatest mistake, Officer Miller, wasn't any single act of brutality. Your greatest mistake was believing that the system would always protect you, no matter how far you went, no matter how many lives you destroyed. Miller finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and utterly defeated. This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, when you handcuffed me and paraded me through these halls like a criminal, you thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the packed courtroom to strain to hear her words. But I was never powerless, Officer Miller, and neither were any of the people you brutalized over the years. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness. She straightened to her full height. Officer Frank Miller, based on the irrefutable evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony. The words hit the courtroom like thunder. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Miller's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Miller seemed to shrink further into his chair. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Judge Hayes paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room. But Officer Miller, this case was never really about you. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid out millions in settlements while allowing the abuse to continue. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. Her voice rose with righteous passion. But that ends today. What happened in this courtroom today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians. No one. Miller suddenly broke down completely, his body shaking with deep, racking sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choked and pathetic. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant." Judge Hayes looked down at him, not with pity, but with a cold, clear-eyed clarity. "Officer Miller, your apology is 15 years and 47 formal complaints too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable." She lifted her gavel high above her head. "But here is what I want you to understand in your final moments as a free man. Every single person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice I am delivering today. Every grandmother you called a slur, every teenager you planted drugs on, every doctor you arrested for living in the wrong neighborhood. They all deserve to see you held accountable." The gavel hovered in the air. Today, I am not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I am delivering justice for every family who had to watch their loved one get brutalized while the system looked the other way. Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom, a powerful promise of a new dawn. "Officer Miller, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder. "Officer Miller, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Miller collapsed completely, his sobs now the uncontrollable wails of a damned soul. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, her voice ringing out over his cries, I am ordering a full federal investigation into every case you have touched, every arrest you have made, and every complaint that has been filed against you. The victims you have silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court. She set down her gavel and looked out over the packed courtroom, her gaze both a warning and a promise. Let this be a message to every police officer, every prosecutor, every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything. And eventually, she comes for everyone. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause that lasted for 5 full minutes. Justice, true and undeniable, had finally been served. What do you think of a verdict like that? Was it justice, or was it revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach more people. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system. Officer Frank Miller was serving his 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison, where his fellow inmates, having learned about his crimes through extensive news coverage, made his life a living hell. His badge, his pension, his freedom, all gone. The man who once terrorized an entire community now spent his days in protective custody, finally understanding what it felt like to be truly powerless. But Miller's downfall was just the beginning. The federal investigation Judge Hayes ordered uncovered a web of corruption that reached deep into the police department's command structure. 12 officers, including Donovan and Russo, were terminated. 4 supervisors were criminally charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree, forcing radical reform from the top down. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, with tamper-proof, cloud-based systems that could never be malfunctioned away again. Most importantly, the 432 cases Miller had tainted over the years were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants were exonerated and released from prison, walking into the arms of weeping family members. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or their sentences reduced. The county paid out an additional $8.7 million in compensation to Miller's victims, money that came directly from the police department's bloated budget. Judge Hayes herself became a national symbol of judicial integrity and courage. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, sharing the story of how one moment of shocking violence revealed decades of systemic abuse. Her message was always the same. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is justice for all. The courthouse where it all happened was officially renamed the Justice Evelyn M. Hayes Federal Courthouse in her honor. A bronze plaque near the entrance now commemorates the morning that changed everything with a simple, powerful inscription. Here, justice finally found its voice. The young law clerk who had witnessed the proceedings that day, inspired by Judge Hayes's unyielding courage, decided to specialize in civil rights law. She now works for the ACLU, fighting similar battles in courtrooms across the nation. The video of Judge Hayes delivering her verdict became the most watched courtroom footage in internet history, viewed more than 50 million times. Comments poured in from around the world, from people who had experienced similar injustices, but had never seen accountability delivered so completely, so publicly, so perfectly. Today, Frank Miller sits in his prison cell, probably thinking about the moment he chose to assault a woman because he thought she was powerless. He thought he knew his place in the world. He thought he knew hers. He was wrong about both, because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice hits back. Never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves justice, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of courage triumphing over corruption, and subscribe because stories like this happen every day, and everyone deserves to see them. Your support helps us bring these incredible moments of truth to light. Thank you for watching.